encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network. Conversations about life, Christianity, and culture. Welcome in four preachers and a podcast from Henderson, Tennessee. I'm Robert Hatfield from Moulton, Alabama. There's Brad McNutt. What's up, Brad?
What's up? Blue eyes in Texas, apparently. I don't know.
The
Some
bluest
kind of
eyes
song
in
you've been
Texas are haunting me tonight. That's what I've
okay.
heard. Okay, from Charleston, South Carolina, it is Chance still doesn't have a MacBook. Hicks.
That is.
But I am here.
Break open that wallet. Let the moss fly out.
If you MALE at thelightnetwork.tv
exactly.
is where you can donate to that campaign. Speaking of campaigns, we have been running a special campaign for the majority of this season to bring back Hiram. I'm happy today to tell you that after much petitions, several court dates, a few custody battles, we today have brought back Hiram Kemp from Bowling Green, Kentucky. Hiram Kemp.
From Bowling Green, Kentucky.
Hello, Hiram. How are you? Catch us up. What all have you been doing?
Hanging out.
Hanging out? Like what? You leave us for this long and all you got to say is hanging out?
Hanging out and eating applesauce.
Okay. Mott's, the official brand of Hiram Kemp.
That's right.
Okay. Well. That felt a little anticlimactic. I mean, I was like, Hiram's finally back, man. This is what we've been missing.
He's been reading German and Aramaic and Hebrew and Greek.
I'm finished my school and that's it.
Aramaic, like, do you have to translate the Aramaic?
I had to take a seminar on Old Testament historical books, and I learned Aramaic so I could translate Ezra. So I read all of Ezra, and that required long sections of Aramaic, and I did that. That was it.
Okay, so like you didn't lead with that. You said hanging out. What you been doing? Hanging out. What you been doing? Learning Aramaic. As one does.
Normally, that's what I do. I mean, Robert goes to Disney World.
Yeah, I mean, learning Aramaic and Hebrew isn't as fun as Disney World. So
okay, I heard a bunch of different languages at Disney World. I couldn't tell you what any of them
I'm sure you did.
But I'm going to tell you this, though. I'm going to tell you this. Here's something I learned. All right. A parent getting onto a child sounds exactly the same no matter what tongue it's spoken in. Okay. So I'm just saying. Well, Hiram is back today, and so we can finally have some heavy lifting around here. And today we have a Can You Help episode. And so this is where you have submitted questions at mail@thelightnetwork.tv. And we've got our buddy Alfred who has chimed in today, and he asks this question: what's wrong with elders using a weekly preacher rotation instead of hiring a regular pulpit minister? And then he says, I listen to 4 preachers in a podcast. I'd love your feedback. Well, thank you, Alfred. We're going to be a little biased in this conversation. The 4 of us are coming from our offices at a church building where we have been hired, contracted. What do you say? I mean, it depends on who you ask. The IRS says that we're Schedule C contracted employees, right? But the church says that we owe them our firstborn and a quart of blood every quarter. So, I'm joking. We're all at great congregations, and they treat us good, and all of that. And so we're grateful to be here. But we are 4 parentheses full-time preachers and a podcast. And therefore, we would be 4 FOR localized preachers and a podcast. So anyway, I say that a little bit in jest, tongue in cheek. The question is, what's wrong with elders doing this? Initial thoughts before we dive into sort of the biblicality of all of this stuff. What do you think? Chance, what do you think? It's right on the tip of your tongue, I can tell.
Yeah, you can tell, obviously. I think that just from the outset, like the question is, I think, a good question, because it's a question that's like, hey, wait a minute, this is kind of where we've been as a tradition. Maybe can we look at it, investigate it, think about it, instead of just, okay, let's just accept this because this is kind of what we've always seen and always experienced. So I think it's good to kind of ask a question and then dig into it to kind of see what's all involved in it, and which way is the way of wisdom and which way might be best, or kind of get the evidence and weigh it both ways.
Hiram?
I was just going to say it's a good question, and it's something we need to think about our role and what God wants us to do. But my first response to it is that men being equipped to preach in the local congregation, various men being able to do that, is always a good thing. The more people that know the Bible well enough to dispense it in a good way that helps the congregation is a great thing. But just and I know we'll probably get more into this. One is, everybody does not have the gift of teaching, and we need to appreciate that. I know in the age of the non-miraculous, we sometimes think if you work hard enough and try at something, you can do anything, but I don't think that's necessarily true with public proclamation. And the New Testament church wasn't a free-for-all. I think we sometimes have this idea that located preachers is a modern construct, and in the first century, they just kind of got together and everybody did their own thing. But I think, and we'll get into this, and we can do it now or later, but there are certain passages that suggest congregations in the first century had a guy that was located in certain places and equipped to do that work. And so I think both approaches can be done well. It's just, we just need to make sure we're doing what's best for the Lord's people and maybe not what's so convenient for us.
So, Brad, I know you've been doing a lot of reading about, restoration movement type times and, stuff. It hadn't been that many hundreds of years ago when you had the fella who got on the back of his horse and drove from town to town and, did that. He wasn't necessarily located. He might show up fourth Sunday of the month or whatever, right?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts? I don't mean to pigeonhole you into just talking from that era, but yes, there is some biblical precedent, but it hadn't been that long ago, right, that there weren't really located preachers.
Yeah, I was going to bring it up, so
Oh, good. Wow. That's what I'm here
because
for.
I did come across it recently in some readings that you get into controversies as things progress. And so, for a long time, the church where I serve is the second oldest church of Christ in the state of Alabama. 2026 will be our 200th anniversary.
Cool.
And so one of the members here is he's been an elder. He's probably in his 90s now, but he has written a book about the history of the church here. And the church here was actually started, and it took years and years and years before they had a full-time located preacher. And sometimes these churches would go Sundays without meeting
because there was no preacher.
There was no one there to show up to do it.
Wow.
And so it's interesting that was a normal thing. However, there were some drawbacks to it. Obviously, people weren't meeting. Yeah. They weren't. But you also had people, these are frontier type towns. They don't really have a lot of understanding in these things. They're new Christians, new congregations, all these types of things going on. And then, of course, as located preachers became more of a norm, it was something that was different, and people kind of pushed back against that and thought, well, no, this isn't biblical. And there are still, I think, even some non-institutional type churches today that would still be anti-located preachers. And I'm not saying the person that's asking this question is in that camp,
right.
But it is a question that has been considered for quite some time in our history. And I think history, along with, first of all, biblically, but history can shed some light on some things here, both the good and the bad that can happen.
Sure. All right, so we're going to get into this a little more, but I think, right here in the first 9 or 10 minutes, you've got a pretty good idea of where we're going to fall on this. It's like Hiram said, it's great to have guys who can step in the pulpit and teach, and that's a wonderful thing. We balance that with the talents that people may or may not possess. So we don't want to stick somebody up there to teach who does not possess that talent and ability. we balance that with James chapter 3. Not everybody needs to be a teacher, and there's going to be stricter judgment for those who would teach. So you're going to hear us basically come down on both sides, and we're going to discuss that. It's good to have people who can preach who are not, quote unquote, full-time paid preachers. At the same time, we are certainly for full-time located preachers. In fact, we are them. And so we're going to talk about this from a variety of perspectives.
I came back just for this episode for my job security.
Yeah.
Y'all are building a new building. It's
Exactly.
possible they could make some additional changes. You just want to make sure everybody knows where things lie. Okay. Hiram, you mentioned some biblical precedent for the located thing. I mean, I think a lot of us think, okay, well, Paul, he was a traveling preacher. He wasn't located. We know he left Timothy and seems to have left Titus in a certain place for a period of time, but we don't know how long that period was. As preachers, we often feel this too, like, how long can we stay at any one place? And you don't necessarily want the Paul or Timothy or Titus answer to that question, because they may not have been there for decades. It may have just been for a brief period of time. Take us down that road a little bit, Hiram, since you've sort of opened that can. Like, what are some of these passages that you had in mind and some of the people in terms of setting some precedents for us in this conversation?
So I think some of the examples first would be Paul himself. Paul was in certain places. Now, we don't know always how long that was, but for example, in Acts 18, he was in Corinth for 18 months. And then sometimes we read about him being in a place like Ephesus for about 3 years, if you do the math between Acts 19 and Acts 20. And you mentioned Titus and Timothy and the work they did in Ephesus and in Crete, and they were in those various places. But somebody might even look at those examples and say, well, Paul's an apostle. Titus and Timothy are on special assignments, so maybe not necessarily the same idea. But then you look at a place like Philippians 2 and verse 25, and it's talking about Epaphroditus. Now, Paul had established the congregation in Philippi with Silas in Acts 16, but in Philippians 2:25, he calls Epaphroditus a fellow soldier and servant, and then he says he is your messenger and minister. So he's the minister and messenger to the church at Philippi, right? There's a specific way in which Epaphroditus is involved in the church there. And there's a similar idea with a man named Epaphras in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 7. Like, he's a unique servant to the church there in Colossae, Colossians chapter 1 and verse 7. So these are just some of the times in the examples where you see individuals or members of congregations and highlighted by Paul as being individuals that actually served in these local capacities. So I'm thinking, again, you think about Paul, you think about Timothy, you think about Titus, you think about Epaphroditus, and some of these examples just show me that even in the first century, there were guys in local places doing some preaching and teaching.
Yeah. What do you want to add to that, Chance?
When you think about Titus in Paul's letter to him, Titus is left on the island of Crete. His responsibility is to speak the things that are appropriate for sound doctrine, chapter 2. He's to remind God's people, chapter 3 and verse 1. He is to affirm these things constantly, chapter 3 and verse 8. But even then, when it's going to be whatever time frame that he's there, whenever that time is up, Paul says, I think it's chapter 3 and about verse 12, he's like, I'm either sending to you, and he lists two people. One of them was Tychicus, I think, Artemis or Tychicus. Like, he wasn't going to leave the church in Crete with no one. He's sending a replacement. At the point of the time he's writing the letter, he doesn't know who that local guy's going to be yet. He has it narrowed down to two, but one of these two soon is going to replace Titus. So Titus is going to come to where Paul is in Nicopolis. Paul says he's going to spend winter there. Winter's the harsh months. And when you learn about Titus and other passages, he's one who has this spirit of refreshment. So maybe Paul knows the difficulties of the winter months. He knows himself. He knows some of the struggles he's going to face. He wants this worker beside him and with him to keep his spirit renewed and refreshed through those times. But he's sending someone else to keep working with the church, and they're going to take up what Titus had been doing, and they're going to keep being the one who is teaching sound doctrine, reminding God's people of their responsibility, affirming these things constantly. And so, yeah, who knows how long Titus was there before someone else showed up, but then he just transitioned from one worker to another who would take his place.
Yeah, it strikes me that there is a continuity of the work. I mean, Paul is sort of overseeing all this stuff. And, of course, we're going to grant that this is still the age of the apostles, and obviously Paul bears that authority, and so all of that. So it's different now than it was back then. But I guess I'm just saying that any local congregation has a wide variety of needs, and the elders certainly have to be on top of that. But it seems that there's also a place for a minister of the gospel to be on top of those things. And to be aware enough of them that he can speak into those needs from Scripture on a regular basis. Now, is it possible that several guys in rotation could meet that need? Yeah, I think so. They'd have to work awfully closely together, wouldn't they, to make that happen? So I don't think personally that the best approach in any pulpit, whether there's a located preacher or a rotation of preachers, is just to do a random smorgasbord of sermon topics on any given Sunday. Or it's like, well, I just think about whatever I want to come up with, and I just do it maybe by Thursday or something, and then I get up and do it on Sunday. It seems that the needs of any local congregation, and for that matter, the ebb and flow of just life in a local congregation, demands some intentionality behind the types of things that we preach to them. And I guess I sort of base that off, Chance, what you just said about Paul to Titus. There were I want you to do these things for this church in Crete. Like I want this to be done like this. Or I think about the epistles themselves. And I mean, they're all different. Sure, they have similarities, but they're different because they're tailored to the nuanced needs of those churches. And I don't know, I guess in my ministry, I'm kind of trying to do the same thing, obviously taking the inspired text to guide me through that. But you read the letters to the 7 churches in Revelation, the same thing. I mean, here's a group of congregations that are relatively close to each other, but they all have a wide variety of different needs. So we can't even just say, well, all churches in Tennessee are needing this right now. It's so localized that you need some kind of guidance or something, be that from an eldership or from a man who's solely focused on that, because he's there day in and day out or whatever.
Go ahead, Hiram.
Now it's the showdown. All right, everyone, please present your right arm. We'll have an arm wrestle.
Hey-o.
Okay, sorry. Hiram, you're new here. Go ahead.
Thank you. I was just going to say, too, this idea of the different men preaching can be helpful in the interim and all of that, but it just kind of presupposes that the only thing a preacher does is whip up sermons for Sunday. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that the preacher's supposed to do the pastoring all by himself and we don't need elders and that he even is a pastor. Of course, the Bible teaches the plurality of elders, but at the same time, there's more to what a pulpit preacher does than just getting up and speaking on Sunday. If we're just trying to get through Sundays, if all it is to check our box and perform this avenue of worship, dispensing the word, then that's a different conversation. But if the preacher, as Robert and Chance, y'all have already mentioned, is ministering the word out of his experience and life lived with the congregation, which is clearly what you see in 1 Timothy. Paul does not send Timothy just on a mission as a visitor. In 1 Timothy 5, he says, these are your brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers. Timothy's life is to be wrapped up in the church at Ephesus. Paul tells the church at Thessalonica, these hands ministered to you. I was like a mother and a father. Life was lived, and it's out of that we minister. And I'm not saying a different variety of men don't enjoy that same relationship to the congregation, but just in my experience where this has had to take place temporarily, it's been more about making sure we can have church services on Sundays, which is necessary on occasion. But for the long haul of the congregation, preaching is far more than just what a minister does. If he's actually doing the work of an evangelist, it's far more than just whipping up a sermon outline to present twice on Sunday and teach a Bible class. And so if we diminish the preacher's work down to merely what we see on Sunday, then there's really no difference in a lot of ways from that and what a different group of men could do. But if he's doing more, visiting, serving, marrying, burying, counseling, helping, and aiding, and then preaching out of that to people he knows and loves, well, that's a different matter entirely. And I think that's what biblical ministry is all about.
Mm. Chance, you were going to add to something a minute ago?
Yeah, I was just going to add a passage to what we were discussing earlier. And really, I guess this is Acts 13:1 that takes us to the church at Antioch, where instead of just one located, there are, Luke records the church in Antioch, there are certain prophets and teachers, and then he lists 5: Barnabas, Simeon, Lucius, Manaen, and Saul. So here was a congregation that had 5 men, at least at one point, who were all located there, working to teach there. Now, the Holy Spirit's going to say, wait a minute, I need 2 of these, and suddenly they're going to go from a 5-man ministry team to a 3-man ministry team, and Paul and Barnabas are going to be moving to carry the gospel and to work in other places. But there is at least some biblical precedent for a group kind of approach to ministry, to having more than one person located in a place working with the same congregation.
Yeah. And
yes,
what you say, yes, working with the same congregation. So, Brad, something Hiram said struck a chord with you. We got an inaudible finger point there. Working with is more than just what the guy does on Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night, right?
Yeah, I would just to back up even a little bit further. I would add into the scriptural discussions of 1 Timothy 5 and verse 17 when it points out that says an elder is worthy of double honor, especially if he labors in preaching and teaching. Well, to me, the implication is that's not the norm. Okay.
Okay.
Why would he point that out? Say, oh, he's worthy of double honor, especially if he does this. So that may be an indicator that that's not necessarily the norm, the way people have communicated it. But further, I would add to that is Hiram hit the nail on the head, assuming that preaching is just about standing up and having something to say biblically on a Sunday. That notion is just it's troublesome to me to reduce our work to simply that moment. And furthermore, there is a difference, and I would certainly hope that there is a difference in the quality that can be delivered and the amount of time and training that you have had. Okay. We don't say, well, anybody could just show up and be a contractor and build a house. I mean, I can say that my dad is a contractor. No, you don't do that. And furthermore, my dad was for all of my life what we called a tent maker preacher. He built houses all the time and he preached full time. And I can tell you that, it's great. It worked for him, but he would tell you there were plenty of things he could not do. There are plenty of things about ministry, sermon preparation time, all these different types of things that it wasn't a choice. Now, he had a Bible with him everywhere he went, and he read and he studied and he did stuff all the time, but he could not do the same thing that a full-time dedicated individual could. And so, you and I both know that preaching is much more complex than just getting up and saying something and assuming that all preaching is just the same. And if someone can't discern the difference between the level of preaching they're hearing, that to me is extremely problematic. If you can't tell the difference between the level of one person's preaching versus another person's preaching, there's depth, there's understanding, there's experience, there's connection, there's all these different things. It's not just about getting up and saying, okay, I preached for 15 minutes and I had 7 points. Okay, so it doesn't mean that you really led people deeply into the heart of God. And when people these are the conversations we have with people in some of these situations, and they kind of look at you kind of funny, like, what are you talking about? And what I want to say is that's exactly what I'm talking about. Okay. What I don't know about something, there's a reason you don't see me out building houses. I don't know anything about it. I mean, and I grew up around it, but I don't know anything about it. So you have to, knowing what you don't know is one of the first prerequisites of doing anything well. And sometimes, and maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm a little salty that some people think that we can be reduced to just a little weekend thing. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and nobody wants to feel as though, their life's work is being demeaned in any way. It's sort of like I grew up around school teachers and elementary school teachers, and you want to talk about getting under a school teacher's skin, reduce them down to a babysitter. Well, it's obviously way more than that. How do you teach somebody to read? I have no idea. I mean, I don't get it. But I sure am thankful. Okay, now let's offer the caveat. So we're not being elitist here. We're not saying you have to have a certain level of training. We're not blah, blah, blah. The point is, though, the person who can dedicate his entire time to that is going to be, let's just say it this way, I think it's fair to say, is going to be better equipped for the work of the ministry than the person who's trying to squeeze it in on nights and weekends. I mean, that's just the way it is. All three of you guys have way more biblical training than I do. I think I'm a testament to the fact that you don't have to have a ton of, letters at the end of your name, though I'm not demeaning
You've
that.
You've been doing ministry since you were 5, though, Robert.
Since I was 5.
Exactly.
Amen.
Let's be clear. You got
Since
the
I
most
was
ministry
5.
experience.
Exactly. No. But I will say this, I would far rather preach at home than preach away. And what I mean by that is I know these people here. I know the needs they have. I don't know all their needs. If you're listening from Henderson, I'm not saying I know everything about you, but I do. We've been through stuff together, and I hate starting a brand new work. There's excitement there, but you just feel like, oh, come on, let's get to the rut and routine of some things for a bit, because I want to know people's names, and I want to know who the visitors are, and I want to be able to look at somebody and say, you know what, the reason they look tired is because their husband is waiting on a liver transplant, or whatever. Like, I want to know all that stuff, and that all of that stuff colors your preaching in some way. It enables you to connect with those people in a really special way. Can the person who is a part of the congregation do that, who is a part of a rotation? I think he definitely can, but he essentially has, assuming that he's doing something else to put bread on the table, he essentially has 2 full-time jobs. That's just the way it is, because it can't be just your 30-minute Sunday morning sermon. That's just not the way preaching works. People are going to respond to that sermon. We pray, right? I mean, we preach for a reason, not just to be heard. We hope that people are transformed by the message of the gospel. So how do you follow up with the person who responded to the sermon that you preached that Sunday morning? What are you going to do with them on Monday that carries that over and helps them to continue that work? I'm not saying that the guy or guys can't do that. I'm saying they are going to have a much more difficult time because their time is even further restricted than even ours is. Now, we don't have all the time in the world either. I mean, but at the same time, that takes the priority for us in our lives. So I hope you don't hear me saying one is better than the other. I'm just sort of giving you some pros and cons. By the way, we've introduced, and I'm going to be quiet because I'm talking too much, but we've introduced several passages. Brad, I'm glad you brought up about the elder in 1 Timothy 5. That was an interesting point. I don't know that I've quite thought about it the way that you said it, that that Paul's saying it the way that he does almost positions that as the exception rather than the rule. And I think a lot of people maybe mistakenly reverse that and make it seem as though, well, in the absence of, Timothy and Titus and Paul can't be everywhere, so it must have just been the elders were doing all that stuff. I don't know. What if we add to that 1 Corinthians chapter 9? Paul is defending, the right for a man who proclaims the gospel to be paid for doing so, but he says the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel, 1 Corinthians 9:14, which makes it sound at least a little more normative if we sort of compare and contrast 1 Timothy 5:17 and 1 Corinthians 9:14. I don't know. I'm not trying to make too much of that, and you guys can call me on it if I have, but if 1 Timothy 5 seems to be saying that it was unique for an elder to serve in that double capacity and thus be worthy of double honor, 1 Corinthians 9 seems to be saying that this is, or at least it ought to be, the norm for a man who labors in the gospel to be supported financially by those labors. Okay,
I'm with you, but I think Hiram had something he wanted to clean up on mine.
Oh, Hiram, please.
I wanted to add a few things. One of the things I wanted to say was this. We're talking about like our getting to know the congregation, but there needs to be something said about the congregation also getting to know us. And what I mean is, and this may be purely anecdotal, but from what I've learned, members of the church love a steady diet of the word. Like they want to know what's coming week to week, and they want to know who's preaching. People have to get their ears and heart attuned to hearing a preacher. You go to a new place, it takes a while for them to get used to you and your style and your just basic outline and form. And when that fluctuates from week to week and they never know who's coming and what they're going to deal with, there's a reason you have a primary care physician. Any doctor that has been in medical school could work on you, but there's something about going into the doctor and knowing him and knowing that he knows you that creates a certain ease. He opens your chart. He knows things about you. And that's a part of what preaching is. This isn't just getting in here and doing surgery with the word. It's knowing the people, knowing the application, and those sorts of things. So I think there needs to be something said about the congregation deserves a steady diet of the word and a man that they know who has been there and has gotten to know them and they know him. The other thing is we talk a lot about like, oh, well, people, anybody in the church can do this. We all need to be evangelists, get rid of the clergy laity system. And I'm for that to the degree that the Bible is. But the Bible does have something to say about 1 Corinthians 12 near the end of the chapter. Paul says, are all teachers? And he's saying the answer to that is no. Mm-hmm. And while there aren't miraculous abilities today, again, I think there needs to be something said for the person who, whether formally or informally or time spent in the word, has developed himself in such a way that he knows the Bible well enough to teach it publicly. And so everybody's not a teacher. Romans 12 talks about the gift of teaching. And today I would say those gifts are cultivated through ability, along with training and the possibility of an individual putting in the work to basically prepare themselves. But the idea that, well, you've been a Christian for this long, you should just be able to get up and do a sermon isn't a biblical idea. That everybody should be doing all of the same things, including public teaching, just isn't true. And even if you have 5 or 7 guys in the church who all could get together and do a sermon, even then, is that the best and most steady diet that the congregation needs? And is that what's going to help the body to grow and be edified? And so you just got to be thinking about the congregation's needs along with the gifting and the ability of the guys that you have. And it seems like overall a group of guys that maybe can dedicate some full time. Paul talks about him foregoing money to be a full-time guy as kind of like an extra. Paul says, like, I could have done this, but I didn't. But he was saying that as if the norm was that a guy would forego secular work so that he could dedicate himself fully to preaching. Mm-hmm. But he's saying, hey, I robbed other churches in the Corinth. I didn't take money, so nobody would stop me of boasting. I gave up what was the norm, what is the typical standard and expectation in ministry, so that I could serve you without anybody assuming I did it for wrong motives. But the norm is, and I think that's what he's holding on to 1 Corinthians 9, or his argument falls apart. The norm is that a guy would be fully dedicated to this work and be fully supported, as also says the law.
Yeah. I think this thought maybe hinges on the thought of edification. Like, sometimes we ask the question, is it wrong for it to be done this way as opposed to this way? And maybe that's not the right question. Maybe the question is better. What's going to be more edifying and more beneficial for the local congregation? What's going to help the church in whatever location for it to grow and to thrive and to be the best that it can be? So that's the better question for each congregation and for each eldership to consider. What's going to be best for building up the church here and helping us to grow and thrive in the work that we're supposed to be doing.
All right, so if somebody says, well, okay, but shouldn't the elders be doing a lot of this stuff outside of the pulpit anyway? Visiting the sick, you got a James 5 thing that says, call for the shepherds, call for the elders. Basically especially like we talk about like counseling, if somebody has marital problems, we could argue who better to go to than your shepherds, and your shepherds certainly need to be a part of that. I'm just thinking about a lot of the things that I do, that you guys do, funerals. I've been a part of congregations where the elders do most of the funerals, in part because maybe I was new and I didn't really know those people as well as their shepherds did. But that probably would be true no matter how long I'd been there. You would think your shepherds would know these people better, and especially to memorialize them. So obviously I'm sort of stacking the deck on one side. How would you guys respond to this on the other?
I would say absolutely, but we're not talking about the elders doing the preaching. We're talking about different men. But if we're talking about the elders, I'm saying absolutely those things should be true, whether you have a local preacher or not. The elders should be involved in the members' lives and know things about them. And I'm for more of that and not less. The more the elders are involved in people's lives, the better. But even in places where you have elders, like the church at Ephesus, Paul still sent Timothy. And Paul had been there for 3 years. He knew they had elders. He met with them on the island of Miletus, but he still sent Timothy. So the elders' work doesn't minimize what the preacher does, and an effective preacher doesn't minimize what an elder does. The New Testament actually has these groups working in tandem. What you just described is awesome, and that's the role of a group of men known as elders, dovetailed with local ministers. I don't see in the New Testament where that's dovetailed with just a smorgasbord of men to do that. So what you just described would be great for elders, but just various men of the congregation being tasked with this idea of, all right, y'all do all the funerals, y'all know all the people. That would not be the very same thing, I would say.
That's a good point. Yeah, and I view my role as a minister as, we're supposed to complement what the elders are doing and enhance what the elders are doing, and in many ways hold up their hands. And the reality is, and my elders get this, my elders are more than willing to meet with people and to talk with them, but they realize that at least some people are going to be more likely to come to me first, at least, and that because they listen to me preach all the time and they feel like they know me better, or they heard me preach on this topic that convicted them and they want to talk to me about it because they want me to dig a little deeper into the things that I said and apply it to their specific situation. So, sometimes at least it seems that people come to me first, and then I'll say, hey, how about we include the elders on these conversations? I can go with you, or I can set up the appointment so you can meet with them privately, and then we go from there. So this isn't an either-or thing, and I think that sort of enhances and rounds out, and to me helps explain a little bit the 1 Timothy 5 thing a little bit too. And I'm just thinking, yeah, you're right. The question specifically was a group of men, not elders. It's the elders who are using a weekly rotation of men that Alfred has asked us about. At the same time, I have heard the argument, well, shouldn't the elders just be doing all this stuff that Timothy and Titus were told to do? And so, maybe the church in its infancy needed those guys directed by an apostle, but now we've got elders, and so we don't need that anymore. And I just don't think that argument holds.
Brad's shaking his head no. Brad's shaking his head no.
Thank you, Hiram. We've needed a Brad narrator.
So, no, I mean, the argument just doesn't hold, right? Assuming, teachers / preachers and elders, those roles are distinguished. in Scripture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, there is a reason that they are distinguished.
Right.
It's not to choose one over the other. It's so that they work together. And if you've ever been in a healthy environment where preacher and elders work together, it really is a good thing where we sit around and say, okay, this person hasn't been here. Who amongst us has the best relationship with them, and who can go talk to them?
Yeah.
Okay. Is it one of the elders? Is it me? Is it someone else? Like, all of that's going on. And I mean, elders getting up and preaching a sermon every so often, I think that's a great thing if that's what they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Teaching classes, doing those types of things. But, you know, the way I look at it too, my elders have a lot of people that they have to be concerned about. And wouldn't their time be better spent doing that, getting involved in the lives of people, and simply say to me and coordinate with me in preaching, hey, we've got some people struggling with this particular thing.
Yeah.
We might not want to, we're asking you to kind of hold back a little bit on this subject just to be sensitive to the situation, or we've got some people struggling and maybe you could encourage them with a sermon or something. So it doesn't have to be this. I think the model that God has given us works perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
And works better. I don't see the need to split it up and to roll things together that God hasn't done. And
Hey,
I
Brad,
think that's
you
what
brought up
happens.
something. You brought up something we hadn't mentioned this, I don't think. Ephesians 4:11, where like there are the actual roles. You said roles, and it just made me think. Like you said, they are distinguished, and that's spot on. I mean, that's exactly what you see in Ephesians 4:11. But here's our question, my question in regards to what we're discussing. He gave some apostles, prophets, evangelists, right? So that word evangelist means a proclaimer of the good news. All of these are specific offices. Is an evangelist or a preacher a specific office? Or is that just anybody that gets up and talks? Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy 4:5, do the work of an evangelist. There's something to be said about that role, about what a person's doing. And I don't think just because you get up and preach on Sunday, every once in a blue moon, you necessarily meet this office any more than just because you sometimes go and visit somebody and do the work of a shepherd in a broad sense as a church member, you're a quote unquote shepherd. And so there is some proclaiming of the good news done by every Christian. I get that. That's not what Paul's describing in Ephesians 4:11. He's actually talking about a church office that's occupied by men who do that work. And so I think that's the need there versus just, again, preaching sermons on Sunday.
So every part has a role, and, you know, later in Ephesians 4, when every part does its share, which includes not just the official quote-unquote leadership team, but also includes, you know, Christians who are, by the way, equipped by that leadership team, Ephesians 4:12, for the work of ministry, then the church grows. The implication is, I mean, not more than an implication, this is a picture of what a healthy church looks like. Like this is Paul's church growth plan. This is how this works. And it includes, as you say, someone who can serve in the quote unquote official capacity. That's probably more of a foreign concept to many of us, Hiram, that you just mentioned, talking about the office of an evangelist. But it is, I mean, it right here in this verse that you've cited, I mean, it's clearly mentioned in somewhat of an unofficial way.
Yeah.
So there you go. Oftentimes we preachers feel like it can be difficult to know exactly where we fit in, other than, you know, in the proclamation of the gospel, or by a hospital bed, or, you know, officiating a wedding, or, you know, helping out a family in a time of a funeral. And, you know, that's just sort of where we belong, I suppose. And yet most churches I know who have elders and deacons often have elders, deacons, preachers meetings. You know, the preachers are involved in that in some way or the other, and are usually down more to the granular level, and the deacons would be a little bit of a higher level in terms of the bird's eye view of the work itself, right? So if the preachers are on the forest floor, you know, the deacons may be, you know, up in a branch maybe a little bit more, although they certainly go up and down a lot because they're servants at heart. And
hanging
then
out in the treehouse.
hanging out in the tree houses, and then the shepherds are like on a helicopter up at the top somewhere, right? they're seeing the whole thing, what's going on. But again, they have to land sometimes to be among the people and all of that. But it's just sort of the perspective that the different roles have to play. I'm making up this illustration on the fly. I don't know if it lands or not, but that's what's happening.
I'll tell you this, Robert. Again, more anecdotal evidence. Two things. Guys that I know that do tent making preaching, as we sometimes call it, often tell me how exhausted they are trying to juggle both things.
Okay.
And congregations that I know personally where they haven't had a preacher in a while, when they decide to go back to the located arrangement, they're happy for the men that serve. But there's a sigh of relief on the side of the church when a preacher is finally going to be hired on full time, and people think, finally, we've got a guy that's going to be, and I don't think they're saying that merely for traditional purposes because they're going to have a guy on the bulletin. It's just more of a, they know what to expect, you know?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's a good point. I just want to throw this out. And again, I feel the need to make the caveat that, you know, we've gone several directions here, and we're not necessarily saying that Alfred, who asked this question, intended for us to go these ways, or that he was in any way implying some of this stuff. He asked a great question, and that's spurned what I believe has been a really good conversation. I wonder whether sometimes we demean the role of preaching because either maybe we have experienced, unfortunately, a preacher whose work ethic, I'll just put it that way, did not allow us to have a very high view of his work. And I just want to say that the Bible has a much higher view than that. And if you're a preacher who's listening to this, you need to take what you do very seriously and realize the importance of what you do and never, ever demean it. Yes, be humble, but the work of an evangelist is an extremely important work. And, you know, if 2 Timothy, if Timothy really is struggling to some degree, I don't think he's a scaredy cat, but if he really is struggling to some degree with feeling like he has firm footing under him, you know, of not being ashamed of the gospel, nor, as Paul says, of me, his prisoner, of knowing in whom he has believed, 2 Timothy 1:12, then Paul's coming around later and saying, you preach the word, or Paul saying in the epistle before, you do this work, you know, you do the work of an evangelist and you fulfill your ministry. He's trying to underscore the importance of the work that he does. And so, you know, preachers don't ever detract from that in what you do. At the same time, perhaps it's just that as Christians, people who aren't preachers, maybe we need to grow in our view of the work of an evangelist, of a preacher. I spend a lot of time in 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, and I have for all these years because I've been trying to figure out, what does God want me to do exactly? I know what I'm not. I'm not an elder, nor do I want to pretend to be. I know what I'm not. I'm not a deacon, nor do I have time to pretend to be. But I think both of those works are extremely important. And I think because we have a list of qualifications, I prefer the term characteristics because this isn't a checkbox, it's a lifestyle that these people possess. But because we have these lists for those two offices in the church, that does engender within us a little bit maybe more respect. And we don't have a list like that for a minister that I can tell. There's not a 1 Timothy 3 equivalent for the preacher, put it that way. But that does not make his work any less important. And you know, in a post-Christian age where unfortunately many quote-unquote preachers have given preachers and the church as a whole a less than desirable name, you know, we ought to be the people who uphold at least the biblical pattern for preaching and preachers. And so I just want to encourage that. I'm not saying put him on a pedestal and make him the pastor of the church, singular. You know, I'm not saying that. But I am saying maybe we need to do a better job at least growing in our respect for that role. So those are sort of my final thoughts there. Let's go around the horn and wrap up anything that we need to. Chance, anything on your mind here as we wrap it up today?
I'm just grateful that I get the opportunity to be a local preacher and trying to do what I can to help God's people. It is a blessing. I mean, it's got difficult days, but it is indeed a blessing to be in the lives of God's people and to be able to open the book together.
I'm just going to say, this may be an exaggeration. I may have 4 bad days a week as a preacher. All right. I'm saying the majority may be challenging and bad. But if the 5th day I can see some fruit from the labors and some evidence of God giving the increase, I don't really care about the other 4 anymore. That's just me. But Chance, what you said made me think about that. Hiram, last final thoughts?
I just want to lead off. I know we've talked a lot about what we think on this subject, and for good reason. But if you are a guy helping out, part of a group of guys, thank you. Appreciate
Yes.
what you're doing, and that does matter. And some congregations, financially or whatever, are going through a process. They're not in a position where they can hire a guy right now. But just thank you to guys that are doing that, and to local congregations. If you've got a man committed to being the local guy there, just appreciate him. And I've been able to serve with great congregations and churches who've been supportive to me. And like Chan said, I'm just grateful to be able to do it. And so I've got my view on what I think on this question, but in places where the ideal is not the case right now, right? Where like
Right.
congregations have elders, those men that are helping to keep things organized. God bless the men's business meeting for sure. But anyway, I think it's a great thing. We can step up and help. And I don't know any congregation who wants less men that are capable to teach. So that's always a good thing.
That's right. Brad?
Oh, let's see. I had a thought.
Where do I begin?
No, I would say something I've been convicted of late. I heard it years ago, but it started to resonate with me more and more. Is, we all have this awkward feeling of, how can I preach on preaching? Because it can be misinterpreted easily, right? I'm trying to pat myself on the back. I'm trying to glorify myself, or I'm trying to get a pity party, but I remember hearing Wendell Winkler say, and I forget where it was an old recording, I think, of an old PTP, like back when it was at like local churches, they would host them for the week. He said, when was the last time you preached on preaching? He said, then that's a dereliction of duty. He said, the Bible teaches about preaching. You have to preach on preaching, and teaching people what preaching really is supposed to be. Because we've all been in a setting where we sat and we listened to someone preach, and people come out and go, that was wonderful. And we're all shaking our head going, what part about it was wonderful? The fact that it's over, or like that? But the inability, what I'm saying is, sometimes there is an inability in people to discern what actually qualifies as good preaching, and holding up preaching for what it really is, and not about glorifying yourself, but understanding preaching as God sees it, as God wants it, and helping people to understand that. Not asking, are there always going to be people who will try and glorify themselves and want everybody to bow down to their every decision? Yes. Okay. But on the whole, most ministers of the gospel are not that way. And sometimes we need to, not just sometimes, we need to preach the Bible in its entirety. And that includes even the profession in which we find ourselves. And I think sometimes that can be enlightening for people, and help them to set a standard for, you need to demand more. Your expectation of preaching sometimes is too low, and you need to demand more. So
good points. All right. So what's wrong with elders using a weekly preacher rotation instead of hiring a regular preaching minister? Well, I don't know that we can say that there's anything wrong with it, but I think we've given a lot of considerations for what would be right about having a located man. And we've offered a variety of caveats, and we've expressed, I think, a variety of appreciations. And so that sounds like a good rounded out episode to me.
I'm just saying, everybody, if you got a choice between, I don't care how good your local men are, if you got a choice between them and Hiram Kemp, I mean, you're taking Hiram Kemp.
I know that's right. I'm taking Hiram Kemp all day, every day.
I've thought about quitting preaching just so I could come listen to him.
Blasphemy. I ain't gonna be preaching. I'm splitting the pulpit here, baby. Me and him. All the way, man.
I'll only show up when Hiram preaches. I'll start the campaign.
Oh,
I'm just
wow. Wow.
I'm just kidding.
I would like to officially apologize to Neil Pollard for this episode of For Preachers.
Neil and Hiram are like the perfect 1-2 punch.
They're the dream team. They're the dream team. If you'd like to express your appreciation for Hiram Kemp joining us today, you may do so at mail@thelightnetwork.tv, where you can join.
I thought you were going to say you can do that by buying Chance a MacBook. That's what I thought you were
Oh, well, okay. So you may donate to Chance Hicks's MacBook Fund in honor of the great Hiram Kemp or Mama Kemp. That's up to you, whichever one you wish
Your
to
choice.
say. Is Mama Kemp doing well, Hiram?
She is, and people come up to her talking about that all the time, and she has no idea. She doesn't know what's going on. She told me one time, I think it was at Equip, what did you say about me and green beans or something? I was like, I have to explain it to you one day.
Have you ever done it? You still haven't told her?
I have not.
Oh, no.
I'm too busy learning Aramaic. I have not.
Okay, all right. Yeah. You can tell her in Aramaic. That's fine.
Yeah.
That's going to do it for this edition of Four Preachers and a Podcast. Seriously, if you have further questions, we'd love to address those. Maybe next time Hiram's back, the next quarter, next year, we'll address another mailbag question, mail@thelightnetwork.tv. Subscribe in your favorite podcast app or on YouTube so you never miss an episode. And until then, stay cool.